Welcome to the case of the Goldsmith's Ghost, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Lost Cases of Young Sherlock, before Baker Street, playing in the year 1874. It is with a peculiar sense of discovery, and indeed a touch of personal sentiment, that I introduce this collection of accounts. Unearthed from the archives of Victor Trevor's ancestral estate, these papers letters exchanged between a young Sherlock Holmes and Trevor himself, supplemented by Trevor's private journal entries, and even some of Holmes's own annotated university notebooks, predate my own chronicles. They illuminate a formative era, from 1872 to 1877, revealing the very genesis of Holmes's unique methods during his university days and the period immediately following. These are, in essence, the lost cases of young Sherlock, before Baker Street, detailing the challenges that first honed his nascent deductive skills. Let us now turn our attention to one such early investigation from this period, a curious affair which came to be known as the case of the Goldsmith's Ghost. Chapter 1. The relentless Cambridge rain lashed against the panes of our university lodgings, each gust punctuated by the mournful rattle of the window casements. I struggled with a dense anatomy volume, distracted by the storm and the crackling fire. Holmes, however, sat opposite, lean form hunched over monographs, seemingly oblivious to the tempest outside. Suddenly, a frantic, urgent knocking echoed from our outer door, so violent it seemed the very wood might splinter. Holmes looked up, a flicker of interest in his keen grey eyes. Before I could rise, another volley of desperate raps sounded, followed by a muffled, anxious cry. "It would appear, Watson, that our inclement weather has driven some distressed soul to seek sanctuary or perhaps assistance," declared Sherlock Holmes. I hastened to the door. Upon drawing the bolt, I saw an elderly man, his face pale and etched with profound anxiety. Rain dripped from his hat and coat, puddling on the floorboards as he stepped uncertainly into the room, his breath ragged. "Mr. Holmes, is it Mr. Sherlock Holmes? I was told I am Josiah Flint, a goldsmith, and I am tormented, sir, tormented by a presence from the other side," Mr. Josiah Flint replied. Holmes gestured to a chair. "Pray, compose yourself, Mr. Flint, and recount your troubles. A spirit, you say?" He leaned forward, his earlier languor gone. Mr. Flint, his hands trembling so violently he could scarce remove his sodden hat, began his tale. He spoke of shadowy apparitions in his workshop, late at night, accompanied by the softest of shuffles, like fabric brushing against his workbenches. The most perplexing part, however, was the nature of the thefts. "It is not my gold, Mr. Holmes, nor the few gemstones I possess. Those are untouched. Instead, it is the most peculiar items, a specific file, a small measure of borax, a crucible for experimental alloys, mere trifles, sir. Yet they vanish, one by one, after each visitation. I confess I found the tale rather fantastical." Holmes, however, listened with rapt attention, his eyes narrowed in thought. For a moment after Flint concluded, the only sounds were the rhythmic tap of Holmes's fingers on his chair, the goldsmith's heavy breathing, and the persistent drumming of the rain. A phantom with a discerning taste for metallurgical sundries. "Most unusual, Mr. Flint. This is no common poltergeist, merely creating a disturbance. There is method here, a peculiar and specific purpose. These items, are they common, or do they possess unique properties?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "Some are common enough, sir, but others. Yes, certain tools, certain chemicals are for very precise work," responded Mr. Josiah Flint. "Indeed, the case presents features of considerable interest. I should be happy to look into this matter for you, Mr. Flint," stated Sherlock Holmes. Relief washed over the goldsmith's features. After Holmes promised to visit the workshop and Flint provided its address, he departed, his step lighter, though still burdened by spectral fears. Once the door closed, Holmes rose and paced our small room, the floorboards groaning faintly. A ghost with an interest in the specific gravity of metals and the tempering of steel, Watson. It is a problem that stimulates. The mind of the thief, be he spectral or corporeal, is evidently one of no mean scientific aptitude. This calls for a consultation of a different order. Later that afternoon, the storm having abated to a persistent drizzle, we crossed the ancient university courtyards towards Professor Alistair Finch's rooms. His chambers were a testament to a scholarly life. Books lined every wall, piled on desks and chairs, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and pipe tobacco. A low hum emanated from an unseen apparatus. Professor Finch, whose kindly eyes hinted at a formidable intellect, greeted Holmes warmly, his gentle baritone resonant with wisdom. Sherlock, my boy, to what do I owe the pleasure? Another intricate problem that has stumped the constabulary, I presume, responded Professor Alistair Finch. The peculiarity, Professor, lies in the stolen articles. They suggest a knowledge of practical metallurgy, perhaps experimental work. I hoped your familiarity with Cambridge artisans or recent advancements in metallurgical processes might illuminate this spectral craftsman's motives, declared Sherlock Holmes. Professor Finch stroked his chin, his gaze distant as he pondered. The only sound was the faint rustle of pages as he absently turned a leaf of a book on his desk. Flint, yes, a master craftsman, though perhaps a trifle too wedded to tradition. Stolen tools, specific materials, it speaks not of wantonness, but of careful selection. Few in Cambridge have such niche requirements, fewer still would resort to such theatricality. I shall ponder it, Holmes. Perhaps consult some recent papers on assaying or alloy replication, answered Professor Alistair Finch. Your insights would be invaluable, Professor. For now, Watson and I shall pay a visit to the scene of these curious depredations. One must always begin with the direct observation of facts, Sherlock Holmes noted. As we took our leave, the scent of aged paper and the professor's quiet contemplation lingering behind us, Holmes's step seemed to have an added spring. The game was, as he often termed it, afoot, and the prospect of unraveling this spectral dilemma had clearly ignited his singular mind. Following our consultation with Professor Finch, whose insights had lent a new gravity to Mr. Flint's spectral tale, Holmes and I, accompanied by our mutual friend Victor Trevor, found ourselves navigating the narrow, winding lanes of Cambridge. The air was crisp, and the sounds of distant college bells mingled with the clatter of draymen's carts upon the cobbles. Soon we stood before a modest establishment, its sign, Josiah Flint Goldsmith, somewhat faded by time and weather. The door creaked open under Trevor's hand, admitting us to a space that was a curious blend of workshop and alchemist's den. My word, Holmes, quite the alchemist's lair. The air itself feels heavy with secrets, remarked Victor Trevor. The scent of heated metal, a faint tang of sulfur, and the dry aroma of old wood immediately filled our nostrils. A faint hiss, as if from a cooling crucible, and the occasional soft click of cooling metal punctuated the otherwise quiet entry. Weak light filtered through a grimy window, revealing swirling dust, motes above workbenches crowded with delicate, gleaming tools. His voice, when he spoke, was thin and carried a distinct tremor. Mr. Holmes, gentlemen, thank you for coming. It is a comfort, though the fear remains, remarked Mr. Josiah Flint. Holmes offered a curt nod, his gaze already sweeping the workshop with an intensity that missed nothing. He moved with a quiet purpose, his boots making little sound on the wooden floorboards. His long fingers occasionally brushed a tool, the slight metallic touch barely audible or paused by a shelf of crucibles. Then I observed him stoop and pick up a small, oddly shaped shaving of metal from beneath a workbench. He turned it over in the meager light, the faint scratching of it against his fingernail the only sound for a moment. It was a sliver of some dark, unlustrous material, quite unlike the gleaming gold and silver remnants I might have expected. An odd little relic, Holmes. Not the usual glint of this trade, is it? Victor Trevor replied. Holmes glanced briefly at Trevor, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes before his voice, low and almost a murmur, drew Flint's attention. This is unusual, Mr. Flint. Not your customary stock, I presume, declared Sherlock Holmes. No, sir, indeed not. I cannot fathom where it came from. Perhaps the entity left it. He gestured vaguely towards a corner where the shadows lay thickest. It is often there I feel its presence most keenly, a chill that settles deep in the bones, answered Mr. Josiah Flint. Holmes merely hummed, a soft, contemplative sound in the quiet of the workshop, his attention shifting from the shadowed corner. The rhythmic tapping from the back of the shop, which had been a constant undercurrent, ceased for a moment. It was then that a young man, no more than 19, I should judge, emerged from a doorway I had not previously noticed at the rear. He wiped his hands on a leather apron, the material rustling softly. He had a bright, intelligent face, though his eyes were perhaps a trifle too keen for one of his station. "This is my apprentice, Alfie Sneed," Mr. Flint supplied, his tone softening slightly. "A good lad, and quick to learn," Mr. Josiah Flint replied. The young man offered a polite, if somewhat cursory, bow. "Gentlemen," answered Alfie Sneed. Holmes regarded Sneed thoughtfully for a moment before speaking. "You are familiar with various alloys, young man. Tell me, what might one use to achieve a particularly durable, yet malleable base for electroplating, something that might resist common acids?" Sherlock Holmes said. I confess, the question seemed esoteric to me, but Sneed's response was immediate, his voice gaining a surprising confidence. "Well, sir, nickel silver would do the trick, with a dash of antimony for better casting and finish. But mind the cooling get the crystal structure wrong, and it'll be too brittle for stamping," replied Alfie Sneed. Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction. He exchanged a swift, meaningful glance with Trevor. "Indeed, Holmes. His grasp of metallurgy is quite beyond what one might expect from an apprentice. He speaks with the assurance of a seasoned expert," said Victor Trevor. The specificity and technical vocabulary were indeed striking for a mere apprentice, as Trevor had noted. Mr. Flint, however, seemed to beam with pride at his protege's erudition. Holmes's tone was casual as he addressed the apprentice again, yet I detected an underlying sharpness. "A most comprehensive answer, Mr. Sneed. Your master is fortunate," Sherlock Holmes said. He then turned his attention back to the elder Goldsmith, gesturing towards a poorly fitted section of the window frame, the source of a faint, whistling sound I now noticed. "As for the chill, Mr. Flint, I observe a rather persistent draft from this quarter. Such currents can play tricks with the senses and even cause loose items to shift, creating sounds one might misinterpret in the gloom." Sherlock Holmes responded. Flint looked crestfallen for a moment, the notion of a spectral visitor seemingly more palatable than a simple draft. There was a slight shuffle of feet on the wooden floor and the faint rustle of our coats as we prepared to take our leave. During this subtle commotion, Holmes pocketed the unusual metal shaving with a discreet movement. Once we were back outside in the lane, the clatter of a passing brewer's dray momentarily filled the air, its sound loud against the brick walls. As it passed, Holmes spoke, his voice brisk. "The apprentice is remarkably well informed, Victor, would you not agree? His knowledge extends far beyond the usual scope of a workshop lad," replied Sherlock Holmes. "Entirely, Holmes. His discourse on alloys was startlingly advanced, and that curious shaving you pocketed, it certainly felt out of place amidst the gold and silver," replied Victor Trevor. "Precisely," Holmes affirmed, his eyes glinting. "And that peculiar shaving speaks of processes not typically associated with honest goldsmithing. I suspect our inquiries may soon lead us towards concerns of a more circulated nature," observed Sherlock Holmes. His words hung in the air, hinting at a deeper, more complex enterprise than the mere pilfering of a frightened old man's tools. The market, I surmised, would be our next destination. The lingering scent of metallic dust and chemical reagents from Mr. Flint's workshop still clung to our coats as we departed. Holmes had been unusually pensive since observing the peculiar marks attributed to the ghostly visitor. The specific nature of the items purloined, a particular file here, a quantity of solder there, all while gold lay untouched, clearly resonated with his analytical mind. His voice, when he finally spoke, was crisp. Trevor, our next port of call must be the market square. If specific, low-value materials are the quarry, it suggests a craftsman with particular needs, not a common thief. Let us see what currents of commerce flow through this town, remarked Sherlock Holmes. The Cambridge Market Square assaulted our senses. Hawkers' cries pierced the general hubbub, mingling with the clatter of exchanged goods. Fresh produce, baked bread, and a faint tang of coal smoke filled the air. Beneath our feet, cobbles rumbled with passing delivery carts. Trevor exclaimed, his gaze sweeping the bustling scene. Quite the hubbub, Holmes. If there are any loose tongues about, this is the place to find them, eh? Victor Trevor answered. Holmes, ever direct, approached a portly butcher whose apron bore testament to his trade. After a brief, seemingly innocuous inquiry about the quality of local silver, the butcher leaned in. Silver, sir. The butcher's voice dropped to a gravelly whisper. Aye, but be wary. There's queer coin about these days. Not much, mind, but enough to make an honest tradesman look twice at his takings, remarked Butcher. Another merchant, a seller of tinware whose stall rattled with every gust of wind, overheard. He chimed in, his voice thin and reedy. It's true, sirs, true as I stand here. And not just the silver, mark my words. Some of these new coppers. Why, they feel light enough to float away, they do, tinware seller answered. Holmes listened intently to these pronouncements, his eyes narrowed in thought. He offered a curt thanks, and we moved on, the murmur of their concerns soon swallowed by the market's general din. Holmes mused, more to himself than to Trevor, counterfeit currency, an enterprise requiring skill, specific tools, and precise materials. The plot, Trevor, begins to take a more definite shape, deduced Sherlock Holmes. It was then, navigating past a stall of ribbons and lace, that Holmes's attention was caught. A woman, plainly but neatly dressed, conversed quietly with the stallholder, examining small metal clasps with intense scrutiny. This, I surmised, must be Mrs. Elena Periwinkle, the seamstress whose premises were near Flint's. Her voice, though soft, carried a certain precision. No, these are too soft, you see. I require something with a little more resilience, perhaps an alloy with a higher tin content for the backing of these larger buttons. And have you any offcuts of brass sheeting, very thin? Remarked Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Such specific metallurgical interest from a seamstress was highly unusual. He gestured discreetly, and we approached a small shop. A bell tinkled as we entered. The interior smelled of starched linen and warm iron. Holmes addressed her with a polite inclination of his head. Mrs. Periwinkle, I believe. We were admiring your discerning eye for materials in the market. My friend and I have an interest in local crafts, Sherlock Holmes said. She turned, a mild surprise on her face, which quickly settled into a polite, if reserved, smile. Her voice was calm and even. Indeed, sirs, one must be particular if one is to produce quality work. Even a simple button requires the right foundation, said Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. Holmes agreed smoothly. Quite so. And for what purpose do you seek such specific metal offcuts? Your requirements seem rather technical for ordinary millinery, remarked Sherlock Holmes. A faint blush touched her cheeks, but her composure remained. One develops an understanding of materials over time, sir. I find certain metals lend themselves better to decorative clasps and robust button shanks. Merely an artisan's preference, replied Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. Her reply was perfectly innocuous, yet Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon her. We soon took our leave, the bell marking our exit. Back on the street, the market sounds a distant hum. Holmes walked in silence for a moment, his brow furrowed. Trevor remarked, a curious glint in his eye. Well, Holmes, that was something. A seamstress with a fancy for metallurgy, eh? Think there's more to Mrs. P than just needles and thread, responded Victor Trevor. He stopped, his voice low but emphatic. Indeed, Trevor. Consider. A goldsmith experiences thefts of specific tools and non-precious metals. The market whispers of counterfeit coin. And now, a seamstress seeks particular metal offcuts, displaying a knowledge beyond her apparent station. The tools stolen from flint files, specific solders, perhaps even small crucibles, are precisely what a skilled counterfeiter would require. Mrs. Periwinkle, I suspect, is no mere seamstress, but a vital cog in a more elaborate machine. Her buttons and clasps may well be the dies and molds for this illicit currency. Sherlock Holmes responded. The audacity of the scheme, linking disparate threads, was classic Holmes. The puzzle pieces coalesced into an alarming picture. He clapped his hands together sharply. His tone grew brisk and decisive as he declared, "This is a matter for the dilettante detectives, Trevor. Their collective expertise may shed further light where shadows still linger. We convene tonight. The chambers of the Dilettante Detectives Club, nestled within a venerable wing of the university, were comfortably appointed. A low fire crackled in the grate, its flames casting dancing shadows upon the book-lined walls. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco. I could hear the occasional rustle of paper as members, their faces earnest, settled into their seats. Victor Trevor, beside me, leaned forward, his expression one of keen anticipation. Holmes had promised a most unusual problem for our collective consideration. His voice, clear and precise, cut through the expectant hush. Gentlemen, I bring before you the curious case of Mr. Josiah Flint, a goldsmith of no small repute, whose workshop has been plagued by a series of peculiar visitations, observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes then proceeded to lay out the facts with his customary lucidity. He detailed the spectral sightings at Mr. Flint's workshop and the inexplicable theft of seemingly trivial items. Specific files, a certain grade of charcoal, a crucible of a particular make. These were the objects taken, he explained, whilst gold and valuable gems lay untouched. He further touched upon our recent inquiries in the market square and the disquieting whispers of counterfeit currency that had begun to circulate, hinting at a deeper, more insidious design. When he concluded, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire. Mr. Abernathy, a stout man with a florid complexion, cleared his throat with a distinct rumble, his voice resonant with conviction. Bah! A disgruntled apprentice, Holmes, mark my words, or perhaps a rival seeking to unnerve the poor fellow. As for this talk of a ghost, a mere fabrication to mask a more common crime, I'd wager my reputation on it, Mr. Abernathy answered. A plausible line of thought, Abernathy, Holmes conceded. He paused, steepling his fingers before him. And yet, consider the singular nature of the pilfered goods. Why these specific, low-value tools? A common thief would take the gold. A saboteur might destroy. No, this pattern suggests a purpose, a meticulous gathering of components, replied Sherlock Holmes. A lively discussion erupted. Theories flew from all corners of the room, some prosaic, others wildly imaginative. Young Davies, ever enthusiastic, leapt to his feet. "What if," he exclaimed, "there's a secret society of artisans behind it all?" Young Davies answered. Holmes met the notion with a patient smile, gently dismantling its more fanciful elements. As Davies sat, deflated, another member rose, his chair scraping against the polished floorboards as he gestured animatedly. "Holmes," Victor Trevor interjected, leaning forward. That apprentice, Sneed, he certainly warrants a closer look, don't you think? There's an ambitious glint in his eye. And this Mrs. Periwinkle, with her odd penchant for collecting metal scraps, it does make one wonder if there isn't some under-the-counter exchange afoot, a quiet pooling of resources or illicit information. Victor Trevor replied. Indeed, Trevor. The human element, the connections between these individuals are paramount, Holmes affirmed, his gaze sweeping the room. But let us consider the method. If, as I suspect, we are dealing with a sophisticated counterfeiting operation, what specialized knowledge or equipment would be indispensable? Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His question hung in the air, effectively guiding our thoughts. The previous murmur of conversation quieted as members pondered, each lost in their own deductions. It was then that Mr. Wallace, a quiet, bespectacled man known for his keen interest in the sciences, adjusted his spectacles and spoke, his voice little more than a thoughtful murmur, yet clear in the sudden stillness. Mr. Holmes, Wallace began, his tone diffident, forgive my intrusion, but the precision you describe, and the specific nature of the materials, it rather puts me in mind of a laboratory environment. Certain metallurgical processes, particularly those involving, shall we say, complex alloys for coinage, require equipment and precisely controlled conditions. These are not typically found, I believe, in a simple artisan's workshop. Could there be a connection to the university's own laboratories? Responded Mr. Wallace. A sudden, profound stillness fell upon the room. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight with that familiar, intense gleam I knew so well. The very air seemed to crackle with renewed energy. It was as if one could almost hear the tumblers of a complex lark, falling into place within his extraordinary mind. Wallace, Holmes declared, his voice sharp with a sudden, electrifying excitement. Your observation is remarkably astute. The university laboratories, yes, of course. They would provide not only the specialized apparatus, but potentially a source of refined materials. And, he added, tapping his finger for emphasis, perhaps even a cloak of academic legitimacy under which such nefarious activities could be concealed. The tools taken from Flint, they are precisely what one might need to replicate or indeed modify existing equipment for such a purpose, explained Sherlock Holmes. He rose to his feet, the discussion clearly at an end for him, a new path for investigation laid bare. The other members watched, a mixture of admiration and curiosity on their faces. This line of inquiry must be pursued without delay. The university laboratories shall be my next port of call. Watson, prepare yourself. We have work to do, declared Sherlock Holmes. His decisive words left no room for argument. As the meeting began to break up, the sounds of shifting chairs and muted farewells filled the air. I knew then that another intricate thread of this perplexing case was about to be unraveled, leading us deep within the hallowed halls of academia itself. The chill of the late Cambridge evening enveloped us as Holmes, and I approached the university's imposing edifices. A light drizzle slicked the ancient cobblestones, while gas lamps cast eerie, dancing shadows. Holmes, invigorated by the dilettante detectives' discussion, walked briskly. Professor Finch's remark about lax nighttime security at the chemical laboratories had not been lost on him. His voice was low, cutting through the damp air. Finch, in his academic detachment, often lets slip observations of profound practical import, Watson. He mentioned the northern gate by the botany wing. Its latch, he believes, is more suggestion than barrier after 9, Sherlock Holmes said. And so it proved. A gentle pressure, a faint click swallowed by the wind, and we were within the university grounds. The laboratories loomed, dark save for a few security lamps. The air here was different, tinged with a sharp chemical odor. Our footsteps echoed on the flagstones as we approached Holmes's target building. Inside, profound silence was broken only by a distant hum and an occasional drip. Holmes, producing a small lantern, moved with feline grace, his eyes scanning every bench and piece of equipment. His lantern beam played over glass retorts, burners, and flasks, casting grotesque shadows. I heard the rustle of his coat as he examined a workbench, and the clink of a glass stopper he carefully replaced. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, breath misting in the cool air. "The dust is disturbed, but not by a cleaner's hand. Note these fine scratches on the zinc countertop. And this," explained Sherlock Holmes. He held up a minute particle upon a slip of paper, illuminated by his lantern. It gleamed with a faint, metallic luster. "Unless I am much mistaken, this corresponds precisely with the unique alloy shavings found at Mr. Flint's establishment. Our phantom Goldsmith, it appears, has an interest in advanced chemistry," Sherlock Holmes noted. It was then that a faint, shuffling sound reached us from the adjoining preparation room. Holmes extinguished his lantern instantly, plunging us into near total darkness. A sliver of light appeared under the connecting door, followed by its hesitant creak. A young man in an oversized lab coat peered into the gloom, a flickering oil lamp in his trembling hand, his face pale and startled. Holmes's voice, calm but carrying an undeniable authority, emerged from the darkness. "A late hour for your studies, young man, or perhaps for other duties." The lab assistant gave a visible start, nearly dropping his lamp. His stammered reply was barely audible above the thumping of his own heart. His voice trembled slightly. I was just checking the gas taps, sir. Professor Davies asked me to ensure all was secure for the night," said University Lab Assistant. "Indeed, Professor Davies is, I believe, attending a symposium in Edinburgh this week. A most diligent, if geographically challenged, instruction." His tone was deceptively mild, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The assistant's pallor increased. Under Holmes's relentless, softly spoken questioning, the young man's composure disintegrated. His assertions gave way to hesitant admissions, fear palpable in the confined space. He confessed to being intimidated into allowing unauthorized after-hours access, believing it legitimate, albeit unconventional, research. Holmes nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful in the dim light filtering from the assistant's lamp. "And the key, my dear fellow, was it an impression taken, a duplicate skillfully made, or did you merely look the other way at an appointed hour?" Sherlock Holmes noted. The assistant, gaze fixed on the floor, mumbled about a key sometimes left in a supposedly secure drawer. The system was clearly compromised from within. Holmes had his mechanism. Illicit use of university resources was established fact, the means of access now bare. Our next step, I sensed, would lead us from these halls of learning into murkier waters. I recall vividly how Holmes's incisive work at the university laboratories had reinvigorated our peculiar case. Now, with young Victor Trevor, a recent acquaintance from Holmes's university days, in tow, our path led us deep into the more shadowy quarters of Cambridge. We plunged into a true labyrinth of narrow, ill-lit back alleys, places honest folk shun after dark. A damp, chill air clung to our coats, thick with foul odors of stale beer and decaying refuse. The echo of our footsteps between towering, soot-stained brick walls was unnerving, broken only by a distant, jarring clang or the hurried scuttling of unseen creatures in the deeper shadows. Trevor, keeping pace with Holmes's brisk stride, finally spoke, his voice a low murmur, respectful of the oppressive quiet blanketing these grim passages. "Are you quite certain this is the correct path, Holmes? This pawnbroker, Silas Blackwood, has a reputation for being, well, exceedingly discreet," replied Victor Trevor. Holmes, pausing to peer at a grimy, barely legible street sign, replied with characteristic, unwavering sharpness. "Discretion, Trevor, often masks complicity. Our counterfeiter needs an outlet. A pawnbroker used to questionable items fits perfectly." "Ah, here we are," explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes indicated a small, unassuming shop front, its windows crammed with such a motley assortment of dusty objects one could scarcely see within. As he pushed open the door, a faint, tinny jingle announced our entry, a sound swiftly swallowed by the shop's cluttered, shadowed interior. The air hung heavy, a pungent blend of aged wood, tarnished metal, and an undefinable mustiness that clung to the throat. From behind a counter laden with ledgers and trinkets, a wizened man looked up, spectacles perched precariously on his nose, his eyes darting between us with nervous appraisal. The pawnbroker's voice, when he spoke, was thin and reedy. He glanced nervously towards the grimy window, as if unsure of the very hour in his dim establishment. "Gentlemen, how may I be of service this afternoon?" Pawnbroker replied. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority that filled the small shop. "We are making some inquiries, Mr. Blackwood, concerning certain numismatic irregularities. Specifically, Roman sestertii of a particularly fine mintage," remarked Sherlock Holmes. The pawnbroker blinked. I observed a slight, distinct tremor in his hands as he nervously adjusted his spectacles. He licked his lips, a small, telling gesture before speaking. "Roman coins, you say, an uncommon interest. I see many items, gentlemen. Difficult to recall every piece," remarked pawnbroker. Holmes pressed on, his gaze unwavering, fixing the man with that familiar, intense scrutiny. "Indeed, but these would be notable for their pristine condition, perhaps too pristine for their alleged antiquity. Have any such items passed through your hands recently?" deduced Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Blackwood fidgeted, his eyes darting about, avoiding Holmes's direct stare. He shuffled papers on his counter, their dry rustling unnaturally loud in the quiet shop. I cannot say for certain. Many collectors come and go. One must be careful. Reputations, you understand," remarked pawnbroker. Holmes's eyes, however, left the flustered pawnbroker. They narrowed, fixing upon a small, velvet-lined tray tucked beneath the counter, partially hidden by a tarnished silver candlestick. With a movement swift yet casual, utterly purposeful, he reached across and drew the tray into the dim light from the shop window. His voice, when he spoke, held a new edge, that keen note of discovery I recognized so well. "And what have we here?" replied Sherlock Holmes. Upon the dark velvet lay 3 coins, their surfaces gleaming with an unnatural perfection. To my untrained eye, they appeared remarkably well-preserved Roman pieces. The pawnbroker visibly flinched as they were revealed, a low gasp escaping him. The man's voice, when he spoke, was a mere whisper, his composure shattered. Those are merely replicas, for the tourist trade, of no real value," said pawnbroker. Holmes picked up a coin, turning it in his long fingers. Fine irony laced his tone as he addressed the trembling pawnbroker. "Replicas, remarkably convincing, Mr. Blackwood. The weight is almost perfect, the detail exquisite. Almost too exquisite for items supposedly buried for centuries, yet not quite right for genuine antiquities. They lack the subtle wear, the patina of ages. These are freshly struck, aged with a crude chemical process that fails a discerning eye," declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes then fixed the pawnbroker with his piercing stare, a look that made far stronger men quail. Mr. Blackwood visibly shrank under that intense gaze, his evasions crumbling. "Your evasiveness, Mr. Blackwood, coupled with these anomalous coins, paints a clear picture. You are, I surmise, a conduit in this affair, a willing distributor of these forgeries." The pawnbroker offered no denial. He seemed incapable of speech. His profound silence was a tacit admission of guilt. In that charged atmosphere, the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in a shadowy corner amplified the palpable tension, each tick a hammer blow. Holmes regarded the defeated man for a moment, then placed the coin back on the tray with a decisive click that resonated in the quiet. Then he turned to Trevor and myself. "We shall trouble you no further for now, Mr. Blackwood, but rest assured your role in this enterprise is quite apparent. Come, Gentlemen, our next port of call is Mr. Flint's workshop. I believe it is high time we laid eyes upon his spectral visitor," Sherlock Holmes said. With that pronouncement, Holmes swept from the shop, Trevor and I close on his heels. The little bell above the door gave a final, almost marking, jingle as we departed into the Cambridge twilight. The pawnbroker's sordid secret lay bare, and I felt that familiar anticipation. Knowing Holmes's relentless pursuit was drawing the counterfeiter's intricate web ever tighter. The chill of the late Cambridge night had settled deep within Mr. Flint's workshop. The usual clang of hammer on metal and hiss of the forge were replaced by an eerie silence. My companion, Sherlock Holmes, ever impervious to such discomforts when on a case, and our old university friend Victor Trevor, who, I confess, looked rather less enthused by the late hour, were positioned in the deepest shadows. We were concealed behind a heavy workbench, its surface laden with the silent tools of the goldsmith's trade, our vigil having stretched for some hours. It was a tense and largely silent affair, punctuated only by our own hushed breaths, one I endured with a mixture of anticipation and a touch of the old soldier's weariness, all born from Holmes's unwavering conviction that the supposed spectre plaguing Mr. Flint was a phenomenon of altogether more earthly, and indeed more cunning, origins. Victor Trevor, shifting his considerable frame with a muffled groan and the slight rustle of his coat, finally broke the silence. His whisper, though low, held a note of his characteristic bluff heartiness, albeit strained by the cold. "Confound it, Holmes," he muttered, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the stillness. "Are you truly convinced this spectral fellow of yours is set to appear? The hour grows devilishly late, and frankly, this damp is playing havoc with an old sportsman's joints," replied Victor Trevor. "Patience, Trevor," Holmes whispered. "Theatricality often adheres to a schedule. Our ghost, I suspect, is no different." He paused, then added, "The pawnbroker's complicity confirms a network. This workshop is but another node," deduced Sherlock Holmes. It was as if Holmes's very words, spoken with such quiet conviction, had conjured the event. A faint scraping sound, so slight it might have been a mouse scrabbling for purchase behind the wainscoting, or perhaps the dry rasp of a lock turning, emanated from the direction of the workshop's rear door. I felt my own pulse quicken, a sudden thrum against my ribs. Holmes, however, merely stiffened, his head canting to one side, that familiar, hawk-like gesture I knew so well, indicating his utmost, almost predatory concentration. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the door eased open with a barely audible sigh of wood against frame, admitting a sliver of the weak, spectral moonlight from the alley beyond. And then, with a suddenness that caught my breath, it appeared. It was not so much a figure, in the conventional sense I had braced myself for, as a shimmering, vaguely human-shaped luminescence that drifted into the room. The sight, I must admit, was genuinely unsettling. An involuntary shiver traced its path down my spine despite my determined skepticism. It moved with an unnatural, disconcerting smoothness, gliding rather than walking, its passage utterly silent, making the faint, almost ethereal glow clinging to its outline seem all the more spectral as it pulsed faintly in the oppressive gloom. Despite Holmes's earlier, confident reassurances about earthly origins, a distinct prickle of primal unease traced its icy way along my nerves. The luminous presence drifted with that same eerie silence towards a specific set of drawers. Its movements were precise, unhurried, and utterly chilling in their deliberate nature. Then the silence was broken. We heard the soft, stealthy slide of wood on wood as a drawer was opened, followed by the faint, delicate clinking of metal more tools, I presumed, being selected with a ghostly yet methodical care. Beside me, Holmes remained utterly still, a coiled spring of focused energy. His eyes, I could sense even in the oppressive gloom, were fixed intently upon the apparition, missing no detail of its strange performance. He allowed it to continue its spectral work for another moment, a nerve-wracking pause during which I found myself holding my breath, the only sound Trevor's slightly heavier, anxious breathing beside me. Then, with a suddenness that made me jump and drew a sharp, startled gasp from Trevor, Holmes struck a match. The sharp hiss and crackle of the phosphorus, followed by the sudden, brilliant flare of light, banished the shadows, illuminating the workshop in a harsh, revealing glare. In its uncompromising light, the ghostly shimmer seemed to recoil, to falter, and then, almost pitifully, diminish. Before us stood no denizen of the spirit world, no phantom conjured from the ether. Instead, a thoroughly solid, if visibly startled, figure was revealed, cloaked in dark, loose-fitting garments. A thin layer of what appeared to be fine, shimmering dust coated the fabric, now starkly visible and explaining much. The figure froze, arms half raised in the act of pilfering, a small, choked gasp escaping its lips, clearly aghast and utterly bewildered by the sudden, mundane illumination. Holmes, wasting no time on theatricals now the core of the illusion was exposed, was already moving, his footsteps soft but purposeful on the wooden floor. His lit match held aloft like a miniature torch. He approached the workbench from which the tools had been taken. He did not, for the moment, address the hapless intruder directly, but instead bent low, his keen gaze sweeping the surface with an almost palpable intensity that I knew preceded a crucial discovery. He spoke then, his voice calm but carrying an edge of triumph that resonated in the suddenly charged air. Remarkable, and remarkably simple. Trevor observed the faint residue upon the drawer handles, and here, upon the very tools selected, replied Sherlock Holmes. He gestured with the rapidly burning match, its flame casting flickering, dancing shadows, and in its unsteady light I peered closer, my curiosity now fully ignited. Indeed, I could now discern a faint, almost invisible powder clinging to the surfaces he indicated, a subtle clue that would have undoubtedly escaped any but his extraordinary powers of observation. As the match sputtered and died with a final hiss, plunging us back into near darkness, a very faint, ghostly luminescence lingered on those spots for a fleeting moment before fading entirely. A final, silent confession from the spectre, its magic dispelled. "Phosphorescent powder, gentlemen," Holmes announced, his tone crisp and didactic, each word clear in the sudden quiet. Applied to a dark garment, it would catch and hold any ambient light, creating a diffuse glow. The wearer moves, and the light appears to emanate from them, creating the illusion of a spectral form. The darkness of the workshop, the victim's fear-addled mind, perfect conditions for such a deception. The specific tools taken, always small, always particular, point not to random theft, but to a calculated acquisition for a purpose far grander than simple pilfering, deduced Sherlock Holmes. The cloaked figure remained utterly silent, perhaps only a shaky intake of breath betraying its defeated apprehension. Shoulders slumped. The intruder was clearly trapped by Holmes's irrefutable logic as much as by our unexpected presence. The game, as Holmes might say, was up. Holmes straightened, the slight rustle of his own clothing audible in the stillness, the faint, acrid scent of sulphur from the extinguished match hanging in the air, a mundane counterpoint to the preceding supernatural events. His gaze, sharp and penetrating, now turned towards the miscreant, though his next words, as was often his custom, seemed directed as much for our edification, and the neat tying of threads as for the culprit's ears, a clear bridge to the next phase of our investigation. Indeed, a most effective ruse to acquire necessary components whilst maintaining an air of the uncanny, Holmes concluded, his voice resonating with satisfaction. Now, we have more than just the pawnbroker's deceit. We have a direct link to the method of acquisition. It is time, I believe, to present our findings to Constable Grimshaw. The crisp Cambridge morning air, laden with the sense of dew and early commerce, did little to dispel the lingering excitement from our nocturnal vigil. Holmes, however, seemed to carry the previous night's success not as a conclusion, but as a key unlocking yet another door. His stride was brisk as Victor Trevor, and I hurried to keep pace along King's Parade, the sounds of early commerce beginning to swell around us, the rattle of a milk cart over the cobbles, the distant call of a vendor. His voice was clear and decisive above the urban hum. The phosphorescent powder was an ingenious, if theatrical, deception, Trevor. It served its purpose in terrifying poor Flint, but the true mystery lies in the motive behind these peculiar thefts, observed Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, Holmes, Trevor replied, his brow furrowed in thought. To go to such lengths for a few oddments of metal and specific tools, while leaving gold untouched, it smacks of a deeper design, remarked Victor Trevor. We soon arrived at the constabulary, a rather grim stone edifice whose very air seemed heavy with the mundane. Inside, the scrape of boots on wooden floors echoed dully, and the low murmur of official business formed a constant, almost oppressive, backdrop. Constable Grimshaw, a stout man whose perpetually skeptical expression seemed etched onto his features, looked up from a pile of papers as we entered his small, cluttered office. He gestured towards a pair of hard wooden chairs, his tone polite but noticeably devoid of enthusiasm. Mr. Holmes. Grimshaw's voice carried a note of weary skepticism. I trust you have something tangible for us this morning, Constable Grimshaw said. Holmes, declining the offered seat with a slight shake of his head, launched directly into his account. He first detailed the debunking of the spectral appearances, his words sharp and precise. Then, his tone shifting to one of greater gravity, he addressed the pattern of the stolen items. He emphasized their specificity, particular grades of solder, certain files, crucible fragments items, he stressed, worthless to a common thief, but invaluable to a craftsman with a precise, illicit purpose. You see, Constable, Holmes concluded, his voice earnest, this is not random pilfering. It is the systematic acquisition of materials for a highly specialized endeavor. I suspect a counterfeiting operation, one of considerable sophistication, is at work within your town, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Constable Grimshaw listened, his fingers drumming a slow tattoo upon his ink-stained blotter. When Holmes finished, a weighty silence filled the small room, broken only by the ticking of a large wall clock. He cleared his throat, his voice heavy with official procedure. Mr. Holmes, your explanation for the apparition is plausible, I grant you. But as for this counterfeiting theory, it is, if I may be frank, rather far-fetched. We have no reports of false coinage, no whispers on the street. What you offer are deductions, clever ones perhaps, but they lack the solid grounding of evidence we require. Stolen tools are stolen tools, said Constable Grimshaw. A flicker of impatience crossed Holmes's face, quickly suppressed. And if one waits for the counterfeit coin to appear in circulation, Constable, the culprits will be long gone, their work completed. The evidence lies in the preparation, in the unique nature of these thefts from Mr. Flint, declared Sherlock Holmes. With respect, sir, Grimshaw replied, his tone firming into a wall of polite dismissal. My duty is to pursue facts, not fancies. Until you can provide me with something more concrete, a witness to more than a disappearing tool or a piece of false currency, my hands are tied. We shall, of course, continue to monitor Mr. Flint's premises, remarked Constable Grimshaw. Holmes gave a curt nod, his lips pressed into a thin line, a clear signal the interview was at an end. Without further word, we took our leave. The heavy oak door of the station closed behind us with a ponderous, final-sounding thud, and we stepped back into the brighter, though no less complex, thoroughfares of Cambridge. Trevor shook his head, a note of frustration in his voice. Obstinate fellow, conventional to a fault, answered Victor Trevor. Holmes merely smiled, a glint of determination in his keen eyes. Constable Grimshaw operates within the confines of his training, Trevor. He paused, his gaze sweeping the street. It is not for us to criticize, but to circumvent. His disbelief changes nothing of the truth. Another pause, his voice lowering conspiratorially. The threads of this conspiracy are there. We simply need to trace them to their source. Sherlock Holmes noted. He paused at a bustling street corner, his gaze sweeping the myriad passing faces, searching, it seemed, for one in particular. For a moment, the clatter of hooves on stone and the cries of street vendors seemed to recede, the sounds of the city fading as his concentration visibly intensified. If the official police will not follow the trail of these peculiar supplies, he mused, more to himself than to us, then we must. The destination of these specific metal offcuts and tools is now our primary concern, and I have a notion as to where one such thread might lead, deduced Sherlock Holmes. With that pronouncement, a new resolve visibly settled upon him. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted. He set off once more, his pace quickening decisively, leaving Trevor and myself to exchange a glance filled with renewed anticipation. It was abundantly evident that Holmes, far from being deterred by the constable's skepticism, was merely embarking upon a new, independent line of inquiry, one that promised, we felt sure, further and deeper intrigue. The dismissal by Constable Grimshaw, though anticipated, had nonetheless solidified Holmes's resolve. He paced our Baker Street rooms for a short while, the rhythmic tap of his slippers on the floorboards, a familiar prelude to action, the sound echoing slightly in the otherwise quiet of our chambers, broken only by the distant rumble of a passing omnibus on Baker Street itself. Then, halting abruptly, he turned to Victor Trevor, who had joined us for a late supper and was observing Holmes with keen interest. His voice was crisp, devoid of any lingering frustration. Trevor, your knowledge of Cambridge and its more discreet channels of commerce will be invaluable. I propose a small experiment concerning our demure seamstress, Mrs. Periwinkle, declared Sherlock Holmes. He then outlined his ingenious, yet remarkably simple, stratagem. His words, precise and unhurried, painted a clear picture. Certain small pieces of metal, specifically, offcuts of a particular brass alloy and some silver sheet, materials he suspected were crucial to the counterfeiters, were to be marked with an almost imperceptible scratch, a tiny cipher known only to him. These carefully prepared items, Trevor was to arrange to be offered, through a carefully chosen intermediary, to a scrap merchant known for his less than scrupulous dealings with local artisans, a man whose shop often echoed with the clatter of discarded wares. Trevor nodded, his expression thoughtful. A clever gambit, Holmes. One might say a test of discernment for our Mrs. Periwinkle. If she's truly involved in procuring such specific materials beyond her usual haberdashery, this lure should prove irresistible. The alternative, risking a direct link to Flint's purloined goods, would be an unacceptably crude move for any clandestine operation, replied Victor Trevor. 2 days passed, each hour heightening our anticipation. As the appointed morning dawned, we secreted ourselves in a shadowy alcove across from Mrs. Periwinkle's establishment, the narrow street before us, a stage set for revelation. The faint scent of damp stone and coal smoke hung in the air. The shop itself presented a facade of utter respectability. Bolts of fabric were neatly displayed, and the gentle whirring of a sewing machine could occasionally be heard, a soft mechanical pulse, when the clatter of iron-shod wheels on the cobbles or the calls of street vendors momentarily abated. The bell above her door tinkled periodically as customers, mostly ladies of the town, their footsteps light on the pavement, came and went. His eyes, however, were fixed on a particular delivery boy who had made 2 trips to the shop that morning, each time carrying a small, heavy-looking parcel. Observe, Trevor. Young Timothy, the scrap merchant's lad. He does not usually frequent establishments of this nature for such minor deliveries, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, Holmes, I murmured, my own gaze following the boy. and those parcels look rather weighty for mere sewing notions. One might suspect something denser than thread or lace within. Dr. John Watson said, a little after midday, as the sun cast sharper shadows along the lane, a stooped figure, whom Holmes identified as a known associate of less reputable craftsmen, emerged from the shop, clutching a small bag. He glanced about furtively, his boots scuffing softly on the flagstones, before hurrying away. The sound of a window being drawn shut from an upper story of the shop, a sharp, definitive thud that cut through the low hum of the street, decided Holmes. "The web tightens, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low with restrained excitement. "The moment has come to beard the seamstress in her den," explained Sherlock Holmes. The bell above the door of the seamstress's shop gave a cheerful, though perhaps slightly too loud, jingle in the sudden quiet of the interior as we entered. Mrs. Periwinkle, a woman of middle years with a surprisingly firm set to her jaw despite her spectacles and lace collar, looked up from a piece of embroidery, the needle pausing mid-stitch. The air smelt faintly of lavender, and less congruously, a subtle, sharp metallic tang I could not quite place, an aroma that seemed to cling to the very threads in the room. Her voice was initially pleasant, though a shade too composed. "Good day, gentlemen. Are you seeking some tailoring assistance?" responded Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. "Indeed, madam," Holmes replied, his tone equally mild, though his eyes were like gimlets. "We are interested in certain specialized components, perhaps some unusually resilient button backings or clasps of a particular alloy," stated Sherlock Holmes. He let his gaze wander meaningfully towards a curtained-off area at the rear of the shop, from whence a faint, rhythmic tapping could now be discerned, a delicate, metallic tick-tick-tick, a sound quite distinct from the steady hum of her sewing machine, which now seemed to falter. Mrs. Periwinkle's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. Her voice was a little sharper now. "I deal primarily in fabrics and stitching, sir. Metalwork is quite outside my purview," answered Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. "And yet," Holmes countered, producing from his pocket a small, flat piece of brass, "this particular offcut, bearing a most curious, almost invisible mark, was sold by young Timothy of Grimwade's scrapyard this very morning. It found its way here with remarkable alacrity. Perhaps you could enlighten us as to its intended purpose beyond simple haberdashery," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The color drained from Mrs. Periwinkle's face. The rhythmic tapping from behind the curtains ceased abruptly, plunging that corner of the shop into an unnerving silence. For a moment, the only sound was the distant, mournful clatter of a dray cart on the cobblestones outside, and the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep within the house. She looked from Holmes to Trevor, then back to the damning piece of metal in Holmes's hand. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and strained. "What is it you want?" said Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. "The truth, madam, and perhaps a glimpse behind that curtain. I suspect your talents extend far beyond mere needlecraft," Sherlock Holmes noted. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her deception, a soft exhalation that barely stirred the dusty air, Mrs. Periwinkle slowly rose and drew back the curtain. It revealed not another storeroom for fabrics, but a small, surprisingly well-equipped workshop, a jeweler's bench, fine tools glinting under a focused gas lamp, a small crucible still faintly warm to the eye, and the distinct, acrid smell of worked metals and chemicals filled the confined space. The faint hiss of a cooling ingot could just be heard. Several trays held what appeared to be newly minted coins, glinting dully in the light from a grimy window. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed, unable to hide my astonishment. "A veritable mint hidden behind bolts of calico. The audacity is quite something." Dr. John Watson inquired. She gestured tiredly towards the illicit setup, her voice flat with resignation. I finish them. The casting is done elsewhere, but the alloys must be precise. I ensure the faces are sharp, the milling correct, and I help distribute them through my network. Some people trust a seamstress more than they would a common criminal," Mrs. Elena Periwinkle said. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the admission. I confess, I felt a pang of something akin to pity. This was not the hardened criminal I might have expected, but a woman whose facade of respectability had crumbled to reveal a desperate enterprise. A dangerous game for a seamstress, madam. What drove you to such lengths? Was it merely the lure of coin, or is there more to your story? Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Mrs. Periwinkle looked down at her hands, calloused from years of needlework, now stained faintly with something metallic. The gas lamp above the illicit workbench hissed softly, a counterpoint to the ticking clock. Coin, yes, Mr. Holmes, always coin. Do you know what it is to watch your honest trade dwindle, to see the gentry favor London fripperies over local skill? My needles, they are precise. My eye, it is keen. Skills that earn pennies in stitching gowns, but applied differently, they promised a way out of the slow decline. It began small, a way to supplement, but the work, it has a craft to it, a challenge. And the returns, they were persuasive, responded Mrs. Elena Periwinkle. A flicker of something pride, defiance, crossed her features before being extinguished by resignation. It was a stark admission, revealing not just greed, but perhaps a craftsman's perverted pride and the desperation born of changing fortunes. And the source of these precise alloys, Mrs. Periwinkle, the one who understands the metallurgy required. That would not be you, I surmise, but perhaps young Mr. Sneed, Flint's ambitious apprentice. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Mrs. Periwinkle did not answer. A heavy silence descended, broken only by her shallow breathing and the distant, muffled sounds of Cambridge life filtering through the shop window. Her sudden pallor and the flicker of fear in her eyes, however, were confirmation enough. Holmes had found another crucial link in the chain, a thread leading directly to the young man whose knowledge had always seemed to exceed his station. Our next visit, it was now chillingly clear, would be to Mr. Alfie Sneed himself. The chill of the late autumn evening had seeped into Mr. Flint's workshop, a place usually warmed by the glow of the forge and the scent of hot metal. Tonight, however, the hearth was cold, its embers long dead. Tools lay upon the benches in an order that spoke of recent, anxious tidying. Mr. Flint himself, a man whose robust cheerfulness had been a fixture in Cambridge, sat hunched upon a stool, his gaze fixed upon his apprentice, young Alfred Sneed. The lad stood before Sherlock Holmes, his usual cocksure demeanor visibly eroded, replaced by a pallor that even the flickering gaslight could not disguise. Victor Trevor and I stood a little apart, the silence in the workshop broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the river and the nervous tapping of Sneed's foot upon the stone floor. Holmes, his voice calm yet carrying an edge as keen as any chisel in that room, broke the silence. Mr. Sneed, our recent conversation with Mrs. Periwinkle was most illuminating. She is not merely a purveyor of buttons, as she would have us believe, but a woman of considerable, if clandestine, metallurgical knowledge. And it appears, a key orchestrator in a rather ambitious enterprise, replied Sherlock Holmes. Alfie Sneed swallowed hard. His eyes darted towards his master, then quickly away. A heavy silence fell, thick with unspoken accusations. I don't know what you mean, sir, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. Mrs. Periwinkle makes buttons, and I am Mr. Flint's apprentice, remarked Alfred Alfie Sneed. Holmes took a step closer, his tall figure seeming to dominate the already cramped space. The faint scent of his pipe tobacco, usually a comforting aroma, now seemed to add to the oppressive atmosphere. From his pocket, he produced a small, intricately shaped piece of metal, dully gleaming. This, Mr. Sneed, Holmes stated, his tone hardening, is a dice-stamp component, one of several quite unique items that have vanished from this workshop. Not valuable in themselves, you understand, but essential for a particular kind of delicate work, declared Sherlock Holmes. He held the metal piece up, turning it slightly so the faint gaslight caught its edges. Sneed's gaze was fixed upon it, his breath catching. Work, I might add, that requires a knowledge of metallurgy far exceeding that of a typical apprentice, and certainly beyond that of a simple seamstress, unless those buttons were, perhaps, a convenient facade for more lucrative productions. Mrs. Periwinkle, it seems, recognized your unique talents, Mr. Sneed, and saw how they might be profitably employed, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paused, his eyes boring into Sneed. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the nervous tap of Sneed's foot, which had resumed its anxious rhythm. Work, furthermore, that demands access to facilities not found in a humble goldsmith's shop, but perhaps within the hallowed halls of the university laboratories, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The color drained entirely from Sneed's face. He looked like a cornered animal. Mr. Flint let out a sound, a half-groan, half-sob that was quickly stifled. The only other sound was the persistent drip of a faulty tap somewhere in the back, each drop falling like a hammer blow. It wasn't meant to go this far, Alfie burst out, his voice cracking. Fear and a strange, defiant resentment battled in his tone. I have a talent, sir. A real talent. Old Flint here, he's good, but he's slow. He doesn't see the possibilities. I read, I study. I understood the advanced processes, the alloys, things he's never even dreamed of, responded Alfred Alfie Sneed. His initial fear seemed to be giving way to a torrent of frustrated ambition. He gestured wildly, his earlier composure completely shattered. She saw it, Mrs. Periwinkle, she understood. She spoke of ambition, of not letting talent like mine wither on the vine. Yes, I took the tools. She guided me on what was needed. And yes, I refined the metals, created the dyes. It was a challenge, a way to prove myself. She handled the distribution, the connections. She said my work was too good for mere trinkets, that it deserved a grander stage and a grander reward, Alfred Alfie Sneed replied. And the university laboratory, Mr. Sneed, Holmes pressed, his voice relentless. Your knowledge is impressive, but some of the work requires equipment of a very specific nature. Was Mrs. Periwinkle also instrumental in securing that access? Declared Sherlock Holmes. Sneed's shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell of his former bravado. He stared at the floor, the toe of his boot tracing invisible patterns in the dust. Mrs. Periwinkle, she knew people, he mumbled, his voice barely audible above the sigh of the wind rattling the window panes. She knew Thomas, the lab assistant. He owed her money from her husband's old dealings, or so she said. She arranged it, made it seem like a small favor, helping a bright young lad with his studies. Thomas was told it was just some students conducting unauthorized experiments. He had no idea about the scale of it, or what we were truly making, answered Alfred Alfie Sneed. Mr. Flint finally spoke, his voice choked with disbelief and sorrow. The sound was raw, like metal grating against stone. Alfie, my boy, after all I've taught you, all I've given you, Mr. Josiah Flint replied. Alfie Sneed did not look up. Holmes, his expression unreadable, retrieved the die stamp component and returned it to his pocket. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the old goldsmith's quiet distress. Your talent, Mr. Sneed, is undeniable, Holmes observed, his tone now devoid of accusation, holding instead a note of detached assessment. It is a profound pity it was so grievously misapplied. You have forged your own chains with far greater skill than any counterfeit coin. He then turned to Trevor and myself, the energy returning to his voice. Replied Sherlock Holmes. Well, gentlemen, he announced, a grim satisfaction in his eyes, I believe we now have a complete picture. It is high time we paid a visit to Constable Grimshaw. He has been laboring under a misapprehension for too long, and I fancy our narrative will prove most illuminating. remarked Sherlock Holmes. With those words, the anticipation of the final act of this peculiar drama settled upon us. The apprehension of a mere apprentice was but a prelude. The true unmasking of the counterfeiting ring was yet to come, and Holmes was clearly prepared to direct that intricate operation. The chill of the Cambridge constabulary, with its stark walls and the distant, hollow clang of a cell door, seemed to mirror Constable Grimshaw's own frosty demeanor. Holmes, however, appeared entirely unperturbed. His fingers were steepled as he faced the officer across a scarred wooden desk. Upon it lay a small, meticulously arranged collection of items, a curious assortment of metal filings, a plaster cast of a coin, and a detailed drawing of a crucible. Holmes's voice, calm yet carrying an undeniable edge of authority, cut through the silence. Constable, consider the sequence. We began with Mr. Flint's ghostly thefts, specific tools taken, valuables ignored. The crucial piece, as you recall, was the minute shaving of a peculiar alloy found at Flint's. Not gold, not silver, but a compound whose trace elements, upon analysis, pointed directly to the university's metallurgical laboratory. This suggested a purpose far beyond simple pilfering. It hinted at a sophisticated application. The stolen tools, particularly the fine engraving burins and chasing hammers, were not chosen at random. They are ideal for the meticulous work of die creation, the very heart of a counterfeiting operation. Young Sneed, a talented but misguided student with access to that lab and known for his advanced metallurgical skills, became our primary focus. His subsequent confession, which I have relayed to you, merely confirms this chain of deduction. He admitted to procuring these specific alloys, using the laboratory with the aid of a compromised assistant, and systematically acquiring Flint's tools for their unique utility in crafting dies of exceptional precision, replied Sherlock Holmes. Grimshaw's gaze shifted from Holmes to the evidence, then back again. A flicker of something, doubt yielding to reluctant understanding, crossed his features. The rhythmic tick-tock of a large clock on the wall seemed to amplify the tension. Indeed, Constable, a far-reaching conspiracy. The audacity is breathtaking, to operate so boldly under the very noses of the university and constabulary. Dr. John Watson said. Grimshaw cleared his throat, his tone losing some of its earlier rigidity. A full confession, you say? And this network, extending to Mrs. Periwinkle's establishment, responded Constable Grimshaw. Indeed, Mrs. Periwinkle's establishment became suspect when I considered the necessary outlet for such an operation. A pawnbroker dealing in finished goods, yes, but also one with a known trade in scrap metals and artisan supplies. The metal offcuts, she claimed, were for buttons and clasps. Upon closer, albeit discreet, examination, bore resemblance to the specific alloys Sneed was working with, some even showing telltale signs of imperfect casting, inconsistent with simple decorative use. Her shop, therefore, served as a seemingly innocuous front, not only distributing the counterfeit sovereigns, but also laundering the byproducts of their creation. Sneed's metallurgical brilliance, twisted to this criminal enterprise, required such a discreet outlet. Mrs. Periwinkle provided it, along with access to a wider circle of artisans easily swayed, observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes then proceeded, with remarkable lucidity, to outline the operational structure of the counterfeiting ring. He pinpointed the hidden workshop Sneed had described, a disused cellar beneath a derelict warehouse by the river. He suggested a coordinated approach, striking simultaneously at Periwinkle's shop and the workshop itself. I saw Grimshaw straighten in his chair, his official manner now fully asserted, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grim determination. The rustle of his uniform as he rose seemed to signal a shift in command. Grimshaw's voice was now crisp and decisive. Mr. Holmes, your intelligence is most compelling. I shall organize my men at once. We move within the hour. said Constable Grimshaw. Grimshaw's tone shifted from reluctant acknowledgement to crisp authority. You and Mr. Trevor may accompany us as observers if you wish, but I must insist, his eyes locked onto Holmes, that you remain clear of the operational aspects, said Constable Grimshaw. We understand completely, Constable. Your force, guided by Holmes's remarkable deductions, will undoubtedly bring this matter to a swift conclusion, responded Dr. John Watson. The ensuing hour passed in a flurry of hushed orders and quiet preparations. As dusk settled, Trevor and I found ourselves across the cobbled lane from Mrs. Periwinkle's shop. A faint light glowed from the window, the only sign of life in the quiet street. Suddenly, Grimshaw's signal cut through the tension. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed, followed by the immediate entry of officers. A startled cry from within was quickly muffled, leaving only the sound of our racing hearts in the still evening air. Simultaneously, as we later learned, a second team descended upon the riverside warehouse. We ourselves were conveyed by Grimshaw to this latter location shortly after the initial breach. The air in the damp, subterranean workshop hung thick with the acrid scent of cooling metal and chemicals. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating the scattered tools of the forger's trade, presses, molds, and recently extinguished furnaces. Alfie Sneed, looking pale and defeated, was being led away in irons, his ambitious schemes reduced to this ignominious end. Mrs. Periwinkle, her composure entirely shattered, soon followed, her protests dwindling to whimpers. By Jove, Holmes, the sheer scale of it and the cunning. To think such a sophisticated operation was active right here in Cambridge. Your methods in unraveling it all truly astonishing. It makes our little club's efforts seem quite elementary by comparison, replied Victor Trevor. Holmes offered a slight, almost imperceptible smile. He surveyed the scene, the culmination of his intricate deductions, with a quiet satisfaction. The clinking of handcuffs and the low murmur of police procedure provided a somber soundtrack to the end of the Goldsmith's ghost. Holmes turned to us, a familiar glint in his eye. Indeed, Trevor, the most intricate webs are often spun from the most unassuming threads. Perhaps, once the dust settles, a more thorough exposition of the deductive path will be in order. Sherlock Holmes said. I knew that look. The promise of one of Holmes's masterful summaries was always a prospect to relish, and I anticipated the intellectual treat that awaited us. A few days had passed since the dramatic conclusion of the Goldsmith's ghost affair. Now, as we settled into the comforting confines of Professor Alistair Finch's office, a sense of reflection hung in the air. Professor Finch, his kindly features marked by the deep lines of thought, settled back into his substantial armchair, the old leather groaning softly in protest. Young Victor Trevor, brimming with his usual energy, was perched on the edge of a smaller seat. Holmes, however, had taken his characteristic stance by the window. His gaze appeared fixed upon the ancient college stones opposite, yet I had little doubt his mind was meticulously retracing each step of the deductive journey that had exposed the counterfeiters. His voice, usually resonant with academic authority, now held a note of profound respect. An extraordinary piece of work, Holmes, truly extraordinary. Young Grimshaw is still marveling at how you pieced it all together from what appeared to be mere trifles. Professor Alistair Finch replied. Holmes turned from the window, a faint smile playing on his lips. His tone was crisp and analytical. It was the nature of those trifles, Professor, that held the key. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He paused, allowing the weight of his initial statement to settle. The only sound for a moment the distant murmur from the college grounds beyond the window. Mr. Flint's phantom was a distraction, perhaps born of genuine fear. But the items taken specific files, a particular grade of emery paper, a small crucible of unusual make, these were not the acts of a common thief after gold. They spoke of a craftsman with precise needs. Sherlock Holmes responded. As was his custom when elucidating a particularly intricate matter, Holmes began to pace. The rhythmic tap of his shoes on the polished floorboards became the dominant sound, punctuated only by the gentle hiss of the gas lamp, a familiar accompaniment to his expositions. "Consider Alfie Sneed," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Holmes continued, his voice taking on a measured cadence. Ambitious, yes, and possessing a knowledge of metallurgy that occasionally surpassed even Mr. Flint's tutelage. His desire for advancement made him susceptible, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He paused, allowing the implication to sink in. Then there was Mrs. Periwinkle, with her seemingly innocent requests for specific metal offcuts, ostensibly for buttons and clasps, but far too precise for such mundane items. And her workshop, conveniently near. A perfect conduit, wouldn't you agree? Deduced Sherlock Holmes. Trevor interjected, his voice earnest. And the university connection, Holmes. That was a masterstroke, linking the theoretical knowledge required for such sophisticated counterfeiting to a potential source. Victor Trevor said. Indeed, Trevor. The precision of the false coinage, the alloy's composition, it suggested access to academic resources, or at least to someone who had benefited from them. Sherlock Holmes responded. He stopped his pacing for a moment by the mantelpiece, his fingers brushing lightly against a cool marble bust, his gaze distant as if picturing the entire scheme. The ghost, he resumed, his voice perhaps a shade lower, was merely a veil for methodical, skilled work. Each small theft was a step in a larger, more complex process. It was a matter of identifying the pattern, of seeing the unseen blueprint beneath the surface oddities. Professor Finch nodded slowly, his expression one of deep concentration, his fingers steepled before him in a thoughtful pose. In the hearth, a log shifted, sending a brief, crackling shower of sparks upwards, a momentary distraction in the otherwise still room. It underscores a vital principle, does it not? He mused, his voice regaining some of its lecturing cadence, the gentle rustle of his tweed jacket audible as he shifted in his chair. The absolute necessity of combining rigorous, academic understanding with sharp, practical observation. One without the other is incomplete, Professor Alastair Finch answered. Professor Finch leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense upon Holmes, the fire in the hearth crackling softly, underscoring the gravity of his point. Your methods, Holmes, he continued, demonstrate this synthesis perfectly. You take the abstract principles of logic and apply them to the tangible, the observable. Holmes inclined his head, a slight, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. Knowing my friend as I did, this was high praise indeed, a rare concession from a man not easily given to accepting compliments. The world is full of obvious things, Professor, which nobody by any chance ever observes. My work is an attempt to observe, and then to deduce, stated Sherlock Holmes. A brief silence fell, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall outside the study, before Holmes continued. The university teaches the what. Practical investigation reveals the how and why in the darker corners of human enterprise, observed Sherlock Holmes. Trevor leaned forward, a new enthusiasm lighting his features. And the Dilettante Detectives Club, Holmes. It seems we've stumbled upon a rather effective forum for precisely this kind of endeavor, wouldn't you say? A place where different minds, different perspectives, can converge on a problem. Victor Trevor replied. Holmes allowed himself a slight, thoughtful frown. The club has its merits, Trevor. It provides a crucible for ideas, much like Mr. Flint's for metals. Perhaps its future lies in fostering this very blend of the scholarly and the streetwise, encouraging members to look beyond the confines of their usual disciplines, observed Sherlock Holmes. A comfortable silence descended, punctuated perhaps by the distant chime of a college clock from across the quadrangle. I confess, A sense of quiet satisfaction settled over me. The weight of the recent, rather bizarre events seemed to lift. The case of the goldsmith's ghost, I reflected, had been far more than a mere intellectual puzzle. It stood as a testament to the remarkable power of reasoned thought when meticulously applied. As we made to depart, the late afternoon sun slanted across the quadrangle, casting long, contemplative shadows. It was in such moments that my admiration for the singular, incisive mind of my friend, Sherlock Holmes, a mind that perceived order where others, myself included, often saw only bewildering chaos, was most keenly felt. This entire experience, I felt quite certain, had only served to further cement Holmes's dedication to his unique and often solitary path. It was a path where the most acute intellect was rigorously applied to the practical, and often grim, realities of human failings. As our footsteps echoed on the stone stairs during our descent, a sound that seemed to carry both finality and promise through the otherwise quiet corridor. They seemed to me to mark not just the conclusion of one peculiar chapter in our adventures, but the quiet, inevitable prelude to many more yet to come.